Hello, everyone. We hope you're having a blessed Good Friday. We want to take some time and share some devotional thoughts with you today as we reflect on Good Friday itself. We want to make sure that we're giving Good Friday the respect and the reflection that it's owed. Good Friday is not just a pit stop on the way to the resurrection. We do know the resurrection is coming and we can rejoice in that. But Good Friday is a powerful theological moment that is deserving of our time. So today we're going to reflect on the scriptures, and specifically we want to focus on Matthew chapter 27, verses 45 through 50, and we're also going to talk about Psalm chapter 22. So while you're turning there, this passage reflects the final moments of Jesus' life. He's been hanging on the cross for 6 hours, and these are some of the last words that he speaks. And so they are important. With his final breaths, these are the things that Jesus says, and they are deserving of consideration. And we chose this passage specifically of all of the things of Good Friday we could talk about because of how it relates to the overall discussion we've been having over the past few months regarding Jesus and Elijah. So let's read the Matthew passage, Matthew 27, verses 45 through 50. From noon on, darkness came over the whole land until 3 p.m. And at about 3 o'clock, Jesus cried with a loud voice, Eli, Eli, lema sabachthani. That is, my God, why have you forsaken me? When some of the bystanders heard it, they said, this man is calling for Elijah. And at once some of them ran and got a sponge and filled it with sour wine and put it on a stick and gave it to Jesus to drink. But others said, wait, let's see whether Elijah will come to save him. Then Jesus cried out again with a loud voice and breathed his last. As we've been studying Jesus and Elijah, we've seen similarities and parallels between their lives and ministries as they have walked out the ways, mission, and character of God. And we want to take some time to reflect on the words of Jesus and understand what he is saying, and we'll do that in just a minute. But first, we want to look at the crowd's reaction or their interpretation. That Jesus is saying one thing, Eli, and the crowd hears or interprets that as Elijah. And so the question is, why? It's a question we've been inviting you to consider over the past few months, and we want to continue doing that today. Why is it when Jesus cries out, the crowd hears or interprets what Jesus is saying as Elijah? Is it simply because they've misunderstood his words? Is it simply because he's got garbled language? We know he cries out in a loud voice, but is it just because Jesus is maybe slurring his words with his final breath? We can try and come up with a lot of logical explanations of how they might have misinterpreted these two words, but in doing so, we devalue the significance of what is happening here. There is a deep Jewish religious expectation surrounding Elijah and the day of the Lord. Elijah is one of the only people in the Bible who ascended to heaven while still alive. And we know that the later prophets, specifically Malachi, says that when the day of the Lord comes upon us, or just before the day of the Lord, that Elijah would return. And so there is this expectation that Elijah was going to come just before the fullness of time, the day of the Lord. The day of the Lord is a profound theological moment that we don't have time to explore fully here. But the day of the Lord is best understood as the time when God would fulfill all of the promises. When Israel would receive all of the promises of blessing, and that the nations would receive all of the promises of judgment, that the kingdom with no end would come to earth. And so there was the expectation that Elijah would return just before that time. But more than that, during the intertestamental period, this is the period of time from when the book of Malachi was finished being written until the life of Jesus. Some call it the Second Temple period, the time when the temple had been rebuilt, the Second Temple. Or even the 400 years of silence, the time when there didn't seem to be any major prophetic writings. During this period, there was almost a mythology surrounding Elijah. Jewish writing from this time describes accounts and testimonies of how faithful Jewish believers in times of desperation and need cried out to Elijah, and he came to their rescue, almost like a guardian angel. So when the crowd hears a Jewish man in a moment of desperation, especially a Jewish man who claims to be the Messiah, crying out, it was quite reasonable for them to interpret that as a cry for Elijah. Perhaps it's a cry that they had heard many Jewish men give before who thought that they were righteous. And in fact, we see these promises of Elijah be fulfilled in the pages of the New Testament. In Matthew chapter 17, Jesus tells his disciples, yes, Elijah is returning, and he already came. And the disciples knew that he was referring to John the Baptist. So John the Baptist, Elijah coming in the spirit and power of Elijah, is the one who fulfills the prophecy of Malachi, and it is Jesus who is inaugurating the kingdom of God. And so when the crowd interprets Jesus' words as a cry to Elijah, they reveal a great many things. They reveal that they don't understand the prophecies of Malachi. They reveal that they don't understand the identity of John the Baptist. They reveal they don't understand the identity of Jesus. And they reveal that they don't understand what is upon them, the day of the Lord. And so it's not simply the garbled words of Jesus misinterpreted by a raging crowd. This expression, this interpretation is deep and rich in theological understanding. And it is describing what is happening in that moment. Jesus' death inaugurates the beginning of the day of the Lord when the promises of God begin to be fulfilled. But it's not just the interpretation of Jesus' words that matter. Jesus' words are powerful in and of themselves. This is a prayer that Jesus is offering to God. And in fact, it is the only time we see Jesus pray words that are not his own. Every other prayer Jesus offers comes in words of his own, and yet here, in his final desperation, in his last hours, his prayer to God are the opening lines of Psalm 22. And so by drawing on the lines of Psalm 22, he is bringing to bear not only the agony that he feels, but the full weight of the message expressed in Psalm 22. So let's take a moment. Let's look at Psalm 22. I'm not going to read the whole psalm to you, but I'd encourage you to do so. As we look at what what the psalmist says in Psalm 22, we will see that there is an immense theological weight to what is being described there. Psalm 22 begins with the first couple verses, verses 1 and 2, being these cries of desperation and almost the accusation that he is crying out day and night and God is not answering. That is the despair that Jesus feels on the cross as he is bearing the sin of the world. And like most laments, the psalm then transitions to expression of how God has operated in history. Verses 3 and 5 talk about how God is the God of Israel and how God had been there to deliver their ancestors. When their ancestors cried out, God heard them. This language evokes the images of the Exodus. In the Exodus, and in Exodus, when God is speaking to Moses, he says, I have heard the cries of my people, and I am delivering them. We understand that one of Matthew's main points is that Jesus is the greater Moses, and that the cross is the greater Exodus, and the bondage of freedom from sin is the greater freedom from Pharaoh. And so, in invoking Psalm 22, Jesus reminds the readers of that. In Psalm 22, verses 6 through 8, the psalmist talks about how he is mocked by his enemies for his faith in God. He talks about how his enemies deride and jeer at him with phrases like, let the Lord rescue him. And we know that Jesus suffers the same on the cross when the crowd say, if he is the Son of God, let him come down. Psalm 22 verses 9 through 10 talk about how the psalmist trusts in God and has trusted in God since his mother's womb. We know that Jesus' relationship with God began from his mother's womb as we talk about his miraculous birth and his rescue in infancy. Verses 11 through 18, the psalmist describes a series of images where he is surrounded by enemies and they are tearing at him, they are destroying him. We hear him use images of dogs and lions that are attacking him. But in that, we have some profound images. In verse 16, it speaks about how the psalmist's hands and feet are pierced, which we know occurs to Jesus. In Psalm 8, in verse 18, we know that the psalmist says that his clothing is divided up and they are casting lots for it, which we know occurs to Jesus just a few verses before the passage we're studying. Verses 19 through 21, the psalmist is beseeching God not to be far, but to deliver him. And we know that Jesus is crying out in desperation, in this forsakenness, the only time he has ever experienced farness from God. Verses 22 through 26, the psalmist praises God as a rescuer and a deliverer, which we know that God is through the person of Jesus. And then finally, Psalm 22, verses 27 through 31, speak about how the result of God's action in history, the result of God's deliverance and faithfulness, is that he will be remembered through the ages, that the nations can come and worship him, and how the generations will remember him, and how he will rule. This one simple sentence that Jesus utters carries depth and weight. We are not only reminded of the prophecies about Elijah who would return before the day of the Lord, which Jesus was ushering in. We're also reminded of the depth of agony and despair that Jesus is suffering as he bears the weight of sin. We hear the images and the realities of his own crucifixion experience being expressed, with pierced hands and feet and gambled away clothing. We're reminded how God could use Roman soldiers to fulfill promises that were spoken of 1,000 years before in texts that the Roman soldiers surely had never read. We hear the promise that through the enthroning crucifixion and suffering of Jesus, that King Jesus would reign. We know that through this passage that the promises of the day of the Lord, where the nations would come and worship God and remember God through the generations, are beginning and are being fulfilled daily through you and I. This is the day that the psalmist envisions, that the prophets spoke of, that Jesus inaugurated, and that you and I live in. Jesus' cry is a testimony that Jesus is king, and that King Jesus inaugurated the great day of the Lord, the kingdom of God, the fullness of time, the eschaton. And you and I are living as the end times church, We have been living as the End Times Church since Jesus inaugurated it, and we will continue as the End Times Church until the fullness of time. We live in the already and not yet. The day is already upon us, but not yet full. And in this tension, we have the privilege as the nations to worship the King, to bear faithful witness to the slain and resurrected Lamb, and to longingly wait and labor as citizens of the kingdom of God for the fullness of time, as we have the privilege and opportunity to invite others to participate in the fellowship of end-time believers, as we longingly anticipate the day when Jesus comes in his fullness, and the work which he began, which we continue, and which will be fulfilled, comes to completion. Be blessed.